Welcome, everybody, to the Family Biz Show. I am your host, Michael Palumbos with Family Wealth and Legacy in Rochester, New York. We are really excited to have you all here. We are going to be talking about the, the angels and demons of business transfer agreements today. So buy-sell agreements. We are really excited because we have Michael Robinson from right here in Rochester, New York, who's done a lot of work with family-owned businesses, and Michael Paiva, an attorney up north of the border from us. And so it's really unique to have, two attorneys on at the same time. And the reason why I'm excited about this is because, what we discovered when we did our pre-show call is that, Michael Paiva would typically be the attorney that would be hired by a disgruntled family member or a disgruntled, the person on the buy-sell agreement. And so he would be, going into court to help them attack the buy-sell agreement and help them get, the best settlement they could. Where Michael Robinson is on the other side of the fence where, he would help the family members or the business partners, design the buy-sell agreement. So we're going to kind of just have some fun today and talk about it from both sides of the fence. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation. If you have a buy-sell agreement, now, after you listen to the show and then definitely jump on and read your buy-sell agreement or give myself or Michael Robinson or Michael Paiva a phone call if you're up in Canada. And it might be time for a review after you hear some of this stuff. So as we traditionally do, I am going to have each of you introduce yourselves and just talk about the journey in terms of, most people didn't start out working with family-owned businesses. Most people, might not have always been in, working with business owners when it comes to, the legal world. So Michael Robinson, if you wouldn't mind, diving in and telling us how you got here today.
Yeah. Hey, Michael, thank you. So, for me, the journey really began as a natural outgrowth of my estate planning practice, because as I was helping families settle out estates particularly after a death, it became very clear to me that when there was a family business involved, it was a whole other world. But it was a world that was integrally related to the overall estate plan. And specifically, what I saw was the distress, the decay of relationships that so often would occur because there was not clear communication in the family, because there was not a clear plan laid out as to what was going to happen with the business when the primary stakeholder died, became incapacitated, what have you. And so it was a natural outgrowth and something that I just find interesting as a general matter. So that's really how I got involved in business succession planning. And as I say, it's, when people own businesses, they own other things as well. So it's all an integrated part of a good estate plan.
Great. Appreciate it. Michael Paiva, tell us about your journey.
Yeah, good afternoon. So, I started my career as a municipal lawyer, dealing with expropriations, or as in the United States, I believe you call it eminent domain. That obviously deals with the valuation of businesses or business losses and how, how compensation is to be paid out. And so that kind of got me on this track of acting for people that were, shareholders in closely held small businesses that, were being oppressed by the majority shareholders or, wanted an exit, whereas everyone else, wanted to keep everything as is. And so from my municipal work, it was kind of a natural transition into working with, business valuation accountants that were hired by myself and the client within the context of a shareholder dispute. So that's kind of how I got into shareholder litigation and other associated remedies.
Love it. Again, thank you both for joining us today. As we talk about, this whole idea of designing, I am not an attorney. That's not what I do, but I definitely just kind of like, if you look at thinking about the planning world from the same as the building world, there may be an architect who helps to design this wonderful building, but they don't build the building, And so we have spent many, many years learning how to design buy-sell agreements or estate planning documents. But when it's all done, we take that design and bring it over to somebody like Michael Robinson and hope that Michael or the attorney that we're working with, dots all the I's and cross all the T's so that an attorney like Michael Paiva doesn't come to see us afterwards. What I thought would be really, real quick, I just want to hit, what we look at as our 7-step process for these things, and then we'll dive into the areas that we're going to be talking about today. But, one, and feel free to, to jump in at any time if you have some other thoughts. But one is identifying all the parties involved. 2 is determining whether it's going to be, a type of a sale, whether it be stock or asset. 3 would be, how are we going to nail down that business valuation? What is, how are we going to determine that? What about taxes? What are taxes going to be a consideration as we're going through when we're doing these things, either from an estate perspective, income or capital gains? What are the triggering events for this buy-sell agreement? So that we understand all the different triggering events that are out there. What type of an agreement are we going to utilize? And finally, are we going to fund that agreement? If so, how are we going to fund that agreement? So I think for when we look at that process, is there anything that I missed or that you would add to that as we're going through, the whole process of designing the buy-sell agreement?
No, I'm Mike Robinson here. No, that's Michael, those are exactly the items that we want to be addressing.
Great. So today, what we said was, let's tackle some of these things and just kind of play with them a little bit. And, the first one we're going to dive into is probably one of the biggest, is valuation, right? So Michael Paiva, would you walk us through maybe do you have an example of a client that you've worked with, no names or anything, but just to talk about, what was identified and, what was the background on that case?
Absolutely. So obviously, to say the least, valuation is a critical issue and very often the material sticking point between business owners. And that's obviously no surprise. Now, we're attorneys, we're not accountants in our trade, but we do work with accountants. Obviously, an accountant or forensic accountant is the professional that becomes involved when determining usually the value of a business. So very often within the agreements, you might see a provision appointing a third-party accountant that will weigh in and determine what the value of a business might be. Important to note that the value of a business may not necessarily be the same thing as the value of individual shares. So the individual shares of an individual that does not have voting rights, or the individual shares of the individual that, isn't a key personnel in the business, may not be viewed by a third party as holding that same value. And so this kind of leads into one case that I handled. Again, I'm not going to reveal any particulars, obviously, but I once acted for a group of majority shareholders that were trying to oust an ex-spouse from the business. And people often say that business disputes are the family or matrimonial matters within the corporate world, which is very true. Anyways, this group of majority shareholders were trying to oust this ex-spouse. They intended to sell their business actually to a private equity firm, but the first step was they needed to get her out of the business. And so the shareholder agreement obviously was very basic. It didn't really contemplate this scenario where you have an estranged ex-spouse, and what to do with her shares or how to value them. By the way, it's always sometimes some agreements actually have an equation or formula for setting out the valuation, based on earnings, et cetera, which is always an option, but
Mike,
not
let me jump in real quick. How did the ex-spouse become a shareholder in the first place?
Yeah, so she was obviously with one of the key personnel as a partner, married at the time, and so she kind of acted in a bookkeeping role, maybe doing a little bit of HR for the business, but she wasn't key personnel in the sense that she wasn't arranging agreements and contracts and dealing with customers, and so she was involved in that capacity for I think 5 years. But because the agreement didn't speak to valuation, it didn't set out an equation for determining the value of her shares. Her shares were not Class A series shares. In Ontario, we often have Class A, B, C. So her shares were non-voting. So basically, because the agreement didn't really set out the process for determining value, we were able to get a significant discount on her shares by essentially arguing that, look, this third-party private equity firm doesn't really view your shares or wouldn't view your shares as being as valuable as the shares of the key personnel that actually held the business relationships, that actually dealt with customers, routinely, that actually it was a trade of sorts, a trade business. So it was, they were obviously schooled in that trade and held the key relationships. So because the shareholder agreement didn't really speak to valuation, we were able to get a discount on her shares. Had there been a strict equation for all of the shares of the business and how they would be valued, then we would have been, restricted, and she might have, and this minority shareholder might have been more protected. So that's one example where, because the agreement didn't speak to valuation, we were able to get a discount on her shares. And yeah, not all shares are equal. And there's a difference between valuing the assets of a business and the shares of a business. Forensic accountant will tell you that it's not necessarily the same.
Love it. No, and that's a great example. Michael Robinson, if you're dealing with this group of owners, what are some of the things that you're, advising to help them think through the what ifs when it comes to business valuation?
Yeah, and that, it's funny, as I was listening to Michael talk, one of the things that occurred to me is that so often, and this is true with, I guess, any form of planning, you got to start with the right questions. And then that's going to inform the rest of the process. So, when we talk about establishing a value for the business, first of all, the stakeholders need to agree on what kind of valuation are we going to have. And that, of course, is going to depend somewhat on just what are the intentions with respect to the business. Is it a closely held business among people who maybe they're friends, but primarily they're business partners? Is it a closely held business comprised of family members, and there's going to be, some intention of ideally keeping the business in the family? So, one of the things I always start out with is going to be a fair market value, liquidation value, investment value. What approach is the expert going to take? We want somebody doing an income-based approach or a market-based approach. It may sound esoteric, but it has real impact on the stakeholders involved. So, what type of valuation are we going to have? To Michael Paiva's point, how are we going to value the individual interest? Will discounts for lack of transferability, et cetera, are those going to be recognized, or are they not going to be recognized? Again, that's going to be a conversation that the stakeholders need to have. Who's going to choose the person who does the valuations? And what if there's a disagreement on the result of the valuation? How often are you going to do them? You do them once, the business is going to change over time. Hopefully it's going to increase in value over time. So all of these things need to be talked about and agreed upon ahead of time. And, that doesn't necessarily mean and I know we're going to talk about triggering events, when somebody leaves the business, that it's going to be happy, but at least it's going to be clear as to how it's going to work. Everybody knows up front, and ideally it will eliminate, Michael, I don't mean to take business away, but hopefully it removes the litigation factor, or at least minimizes it.
Of course. Oh, I love it. And, one of the things that we like to talk about when we're dealing with business owners is that there's the potential that the business could be infinite. It could go on for generations. It could supersede each and every person that's running the business today. That's kind of many people's, they think of it as their legacy, and that's what they're hope for. Maybe it turns ESOP. So there's always, a way down the road. But the one thing that people forget is that human beings are finite. And so this will end, and I think that, a good friend of mine always said, when you're teaching your kids, when you're talking to people, and if there's something that sounds, a little out there, you got to ask them, how does this end? And that's really what we're doing, with this business agreement. And when we're starting business or we're getting into business, we're all excited about it. And it's, the attorney who's our buddy that helped us with our real estate closings, maybe the attorney that we go to do, hey, we heard we need one of these buy-sell agreements. Why don't you zap one together for us? And they grab the boilerplate and put it together. And now everybody signs it and they have it. But they didn't ever have the discussion, right? And I think that's what you're getting to, Michael, is, what are the questions? How does this going to end? What if this ends? And it's so much easier when we're excited about and everything's on good terms to have a logical, conversation about these things, right? When Michael Paiva, when you look at the other people's buy-sell agreements, what would you say, from a valuation standpoint, what do you see most often? If you had to pick, I know you see everything, but is there a basic, the templated document says where you see X, how you're going to value the business over and over again?
To be honest, Michael, I see so many agreements that don't even address the point, which is if our viewers can take anything away from today, it's please make sure a valuation question is addressed explicitly and expressly. Mr. Robinson had some great points on what to be considered. But usually when there is a valuation equation in the agreement, Michael, a lot of the times it says that valuation questions are supposed to be resolved first by mediation, or in the alternative, if mediation fails, arbitration, which here in Ontario, arbitration and mediation are very, they're much cheaper and much more streamlined and quicker than the fundamental court process. So very often that will be addressed. And the other thing that I do see when we have an agreement that addresses valuation is, a statement as to who or which professional will weigh in. So very often it is the business accountant that is trusted by all parties, that knows the business inside and out, that will be designated as the individual that's supposed to determine, the valuation of individual shares. Other agreements, there's an actual equation as to how the business will be valued, which doesn't necessarily mean that the parties are going to accept that or agree to it. If later on they think, well, I'm being unfairly prejudiced or I'm being unfairly targeted, as a minority shareholder, they may actually push back on that equation. But those are the things I see: designating the professional, mediation or arbitration to determine. And the other thing I see is an equation, a metric by which, the parties agree to how it will be valued.
Gotcha.
And Michael, to Michael Paiva's point, it is so important to have an objective professional do the valuation. When people begin a business, they have emotional investment in that enterprise, and it's difficult to be objective oftentimes. And two, it could be an issue you're very good at what the business does, but that doesn't mean you're a business valuation expert. So just having that objective assessment of the business's value is absolutely critical. You may choose to allow subjective factors to come into play later on, especially if it's a family enterprise, but you need to have that objective starting point so you can decide whether to allow subjective matters to be considered, and if so, how.
Great. One of the things when we were together before, we talked about, when you see people utilizing the term book value as the valuation of, the process or, of the business. Michael Robinson, do you want to take just what are some of the issues with just utilizing book value? And I do think there's probably a time, like, if you've got a startup and there's really no value of the business at that point, right? But
Sure. And you're right. And, the type of valuation that you do may evolve over time and again, needs to be revisited periodically by the stakeholders. But, as you say, if it's a startup, I mean, that's really all there is book value, realistically. And so, assess the assets and there you go. But for a going concern, book value is, unless the intent is when one of the triggering events happens, the business is going to be sold or just liquidated, I should say. Book value is interesting, but I don't find it terribly helpful for the most part. If it's going to be a going concern, you want to value it as a going concern because that's what reflects the true value of the enterprise.
Michael Paiva, any comments to that as well?
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point, Michael. I mean, business valuation is an art. It is not a science, despite working with numbers that are objectively in existence. Because very good forensic accountants can look at the same data and come up with a very, very different conclusion on valuation. So that would be my point.
Yeah, no, I think I want to jump on what you just said there and add to that a little bit is business valuation. You need to think about it as a spectrum. If I'm giving my business to my next generation children, I may, from a gift standpoint, I want that gift to be as small as possible. So I'm not, using up my gift tax, that I have, given my, available. If I'm selling to an ESOP and I want my employees to really get the value out of the business, I've taken everything I need out of the business. It might be different than if I'm selling to an ESOP and I haven't. This is my retirement plan. And the same thing I would think goes for management buyouts. When you start moving into selling to a third party, to an outsider, now it's, what is a willing buyer and a willing seller agreeing to, right? I think it's that arm's length agreement. And then when you start moving into that M&A world or investment banking world, you might be hoping and looking for, like a private equity group where you might have the second bite of an apple, where you're only selling 80% of your business and you're keeping it as a going concern and you're there. You might find synergistic value where somebody says, my, company A and your company B actually equals more than the sum of them separately. And so I'm willing to pay more than anybody else is because of that. And so, thinking about these things in advance really makes a big difference, which goes back to why, right, the business valuation is an art form as much as, there's the science to it. One more thing on book value, and then I'll open back up again. I apologize, but the other thing that struck me is you may have book value, because you check the box to get your buy-sell agreement when I'm going into business, or, I'm in business for 3 to 4 years and an advisor says, where's your, buy-sell agreement? And I've just checked the box. And I think it's a lot like a home mortgage. If interest rates continue to drop, you really have to think about, should I refinance my house, my mortgage? Is it worth, am I going to save on doing that? And with a going business concern, it would be the same thing. It's, every 3 to 5 years, at a minimum, I may, sit down with my partners, sit down with my advisor And as you know, Michael Robinson, as you said, I need to have the right questions asked to me at that point, because what I'm thinking today could be different. Michael Robinson, anything to add?
No, I think that's exactly correct. And I actually did want to just piggyback on one other thing that you mentioned, that I know we're not into, we don't want to get into the weeds on taxes, but as we kind of acknowledged at the outset, when people own a business, they own other things too. It's not just the business. And another reason that you want to understand the value of your interest in the business is because it is going to impact your other planning, not only from a tax standpoint, but how are you treating, again, if it's a family situation, how are you treating family members who may not be involved in the business? You need to have that value information in order to make those kinds of decisions.
Sure. Love that. I mean, real quick, one of the things that, we as business coaches, we want to help them not just protect the business, but we want to help them actually grow the business. And so that leads to a whole nother discussion. Should we be growing the value of the business inside your state or outside of your state? That's,
Sure.
So let's, there's a ton around valuation. We could probably do the whole show on valuation, but I want to talk about triggering events. And there is a number of different triggering events. And I think, some people call them, what are they, the 7 Ds or the 8 Ds, or, I think other people might even, pick more. So Michael Robinson, why don't you give us 3 or 4 of the triggering events? Michael Paiva, if we can pick up between the two of us and see if we can't hit some of the other definitions of triggering events.
Sure. So, death is one of the most common triggering events that the buy sell is going to address. One that I do see overlooked, but is related, is what about incapacity or disability? And that's going to depend on a number of factors in terms of, is someone actively involved in the business or just a financial stakeholder? One of the ones that I also see overlooked, and Michael Paiva brought it up in his case study, what happens if there's a divorce among parties? And so that needs to be addressed. What if somebody just wants out? Can they do that? If so, how does that work? Those are just some of the factors that we would want to be addressing.
Great. Michael Paiva, I think that there's some people might say esoteric triggering events. Do you want to add to some of the ones that Michael Robinson came up with?
One I've been dealing with lately is just quite simply retirement and just wanting out. I think it's so basic, but it can actually create a lot of problems, especially when the valuation, not to go back to valuation, but when the valuation of the assets has just skyrocketed, and then, okay, I'm good now. I should be able to sell my stake. I don't want to be bothered with this anymore. I'm 60 years old. I can make a few million here on an exit. So really, I think about retirement. Think about, what is a valid way to exit the business, and is retirement even valid or not? The other parties may not be able to even afford to buy you out just because the valuation has skyrocketed. Thinking of other client file where this company owned a good sized residence that was converted into a restaurant in Toronto. Okay. Toronto real estate prices are absolutely insane and have been for 10 years. And all of a sudden, this couple $1 million investments were $6 million. And they wanted out. Quite simply, they wanted to just cash out and retire. The other 2 partners wouldn't go along with it. They held the majority stake. So really, it's, when is it permissible for someone to exit the business and retire or not? Sure. And if it's not, then how do you deal with it?
Right. So some of those trigger events that you just hit on, I think you might call them disagreement. We have a disagreement about things, and how are we going to do that? What if you wanted, I think about the case study that you said earlier, Michael, and what if they wanted to terminate that person versus they were selling the business, And I think that's a really good point is, you get that unsolicited offer for your business, and it's bigger than anybody thinks about. And you've got that one holdout partner. And we don't have that agreement. As we're talking about triggering events, Michael Paiva, is there any case studies or any, an example of a company that, the triggering event was really the sticking point as you were going through, the case?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we had dealt with a case where quite simply our client had worked for this family-run, closely held business for, I think, 20, 30 years. He's in his mid-60s. He had, saved his money along the way. He was ready to exit. Okay. And, he was a minority shareholder, not C-suite executive, not a chief anything, but, a relatively upper management styled position. On paper, he didn't hold that much leverage, so eventually we had to commence litigation because the company wanted to merge with another related party, in their area of business, and my guy wanted out. And so essentially, the shareholders took the position that, well, we don't care if you want to retire, we're trying to merge, and you're not going to screw this up for us, because that would be unfair to the other shareholders. And so, eventually the resolution contemplated terminating his employment, paying severance, and paying out his shares. So that was the ultimate resolution. But yeah, the triggering event of retirement or just wanting out is probably one of the trickier ones to deal with, as opposed to, say, disability or incapacity or so.
Sure. Michael Robinson, when you're, thinking about, these triggering events, I want to go back to, I love, what you said, the right questions. What are some of the questions that you're asking clients to help them think through, when somebody wants out, or death, or disability, or just there's a disagreement? What are some of those questions?
Sure. So, one of them is sort of the overall big question is just, what is your vision for the business? And make sure that there's alignment there, because as Michael Paiva was just saying, some people may view it as a retirement plan. Others may view it as an ongoing income generator that they might pass on, to others. So just what's the vision? Secondly, and related, who do you want to work with? And maybe more importantly, who do you not want to work with? So we want to make sure that the right people, and by the right people, I mean from the perspective of the stakeholders, that the right people are going to remain involved in the business. Are all stakeholders going to be treated the same way when various triggering events occur? Maybe, maybe not, especially if you have people with differing ownership interests. You have majority stakeholders, minority stakeholders. How does that, how do you view that? Because that can be interesting. So, those are some of the basic questions, but the key is to have the conversations before everybody commits, and not, when somebody turns 70 years old and decides that they want out of the business.
Yeah. And I think as you're going through and looking at these triggering events, there's, option A, B, or C in many of these scenarios. If I want to retire at the age of, 40 because I won the lottery, but I'm still trying to get full share, value of my shares, is that going to be putting, undue stress on the business? Or my wife wants to move, and we're making that change, and so we're doing that early, versus I put in 35 years in the business, and now I'm 65 years old, and and I want to retire, and I deserve to be able to retire, but just because you don't have the well thought out plan to say, how are we going to do this, is that really on me to do that? You talked, Michael Paiva, we talked about, the disagreement piece. I want to when those things happen, and Michael Robinson, you probably have, some things that you're going to want to add to this, but what do you do? What do you put into the document? How do you, when you have somebody that's disagreeing, how do you address that in advance? How do you think about those things?
A lot of the time, just even having a dispute resolution clause is really important. So you can have something that says, look, if there's a dispute about valuation, or there's a dispute about someone's exit, this is the process that we're going to follow to resolve it. So we're going to mediate the issue. If we can't resolve it by mediation, then we're going to arbitrate the issue. And so you can really set out the process for a dispute resolution with great particularity. Who's going to pay legal fees? Are the parties going to bear their own costs? Who will be the decision maker? What mediator are you going to use? Who will be the professional accountant? Will each side have their own accountant, or will there be a neutral third party, one accountant to save money as opposed to paying two to help resolve the issue? So really having a dispute mechanism is a great way to at least address what happens. Then usually the clause will say something vague like, oh, the parties agree to negotiate in good faith. As we know, when money's at play, saying, okay, we agree to negotiate in good faith, it's really quite meaningless at the end of the day. But what you don't want to do is, if you can avoid it, do not leave the decision making to someone that is a court, because you'll likely, both sides will likely feel disappointed at the end of the day.
Great.
Yeah, and I would agree with what Michael Paiva just said. It is so important to have a clear and specific method for dealing with disputes that arise. Certainly in the drafting component, you try to address as much of that as you can and eliminate opportunities for disagreements, but you can't anticipate everything. And I'm reminded of the saying, no man or woman steps into the same river twice, because it's not the same river and they're not the same man or woman. Things change and people's circumstances change. So as much as we try to identify and take care of those things up front, a clear dispute resolution process is critical. Great.
There's some phrases in the buy sell world that people might not be familiar with. I think they'd be worth talking about, but I'm just trying to think that Russian roulette inside of the business agreement, or can you talk about some of those at all? Is that making sense? Am I making sense to you? Am I catching that? It's kind of like, I think there's, when it comes to the value of the business, if there's a disagreement, how do we, settle the disagreement other than arbitration? I think there's some clauses that have been put into buy-sell agreements to just outline to say, if you want to leave, that's great. You set the price, but I get to decide whether I'm a buyer or a seller. Does that ring a bell to either of you, or is that just something that?
Yeah, I mean, you've got shotgun clauses, you've got piggyback clauses, you've got drag along clauses. And just important to note, just because you want out doesn't mean that you can necessarily prejudice the other shareholders. Very fundamental point. Like, you don't have all the rights in the world just because you simply want out as a minority shareholder, as a 1/3 shareholder. Like, you can't screw over the business, especially if you're key personnel. Right. But yeah, you can of course have rights of first refusal to then first offer the shares to the partners. You can have any share transfer conditional on the approval of all other shareholders, so that you don't bring someone into the business that you don't want to be partners with. So yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can draft that up in the agreement. I don't know, Mr. Robinson, if what you put into your agreements beyond that, but.
No, I mean, I think that's just exactly right. It's all part of the, how do you want it to work? And, think of all the bad stuff that can happen and hope that it doesn't, but make sure you've addressed it.
Great. What happens, in a termination kind of, situation? Somebody's terminated for cause. They, have done something that hurts the reputation of the business. How do you address, should I be buying that partner out for full value? Is there, what are some of the conversations around that type of what if?
Sure. No, that, malfeasance, misfeasance, yeah, that certainly is something that should be addressed in the agreement. And is, Michael Palumbos, as you just said, well, assuming that the criteria for removing somebody are met, what is the monetary result? Do they suffer some kind of a discount because of what they did or did not do? Those things come up, and it's unfortunate, but it happens, and the parties need to think about that.
And that's a good point. And, you've got the employment question, which is, what is the employment compensation owing, for a long-time employee? But, that doesn't necessarily mean that their share value or their share interest necessarily takes a hit as a result. Maybe in the situation where you have malfeasance or misfeasance, then I can see maybe a discount to shares being applied. But just to be clear, there are two questions. It's one, what is the employment compensation owing, and what is the share compensation owing? And the two aren't the same, but they can definitely overlap.
Great. I think, some of the other things to think about is, on these triggering events, and again, we could get lost in the weeds on all of this stuff. There's, tons of places to go, but inside of there is to be thinking about, what are the terms? If somebody owns 30% of the company and you've got a $10 million company, where's the company now coming up with the $3 million, and what are the terms, and what is the impact that that's going to have on the company? Which, it's going to go into our funding in a second. That's so I'll save some more of that there, but I'm looking forward to that one, obviously. Disability, I want to hit that real quick. Michael Robinson, disability and a C corporation, if it's not covered in the buy-sell agreement, are there any, issues that could come up for the business, when you don't have that covered?
Yeah, it will depend to a significant degree on what is this stakeholders' involvement. So once again, are they simply a part owner, and they're otherwise passive with respect to their involvement, or are they an employee of the company? So that's a tricky one. Certainly you want to identify what does incapacity mean. It's not just physical incapacity. It's something that prohibits somebody from being able to do their job properly, and to be contributing to the enterprise properly. So once again, just defining the term in terms of is it a triggering event or not? And then as Michael Paiva was saying, two very different considerations. One is if they're an employee, what does that do to their position? They may have to be removed, but they may not be at all impacted in terms of their ownership interest.
Right. Yeah, because you're treated differently if you're working there. The C corporation, if it continues your salary, if you're not working there any longer, no, you've got a whole different issue. So there's, these buy-sell things, even though we're talking buy-sell agreement, you also have to look at it from an employment standpoint, because more often than not in the small to medium-sized business, the owners are employees and taking a salary from the business as well.
If you've got your disabled partner, that's the main rainmaker. Sure. Then the company can't really operate without that disabled partner. Is it practical to be paid full pop, or to pay out for the other shareholders to pay out full pop for the rainmaker's interest? It's just impractical sometimes.
Right.
And so you've got to have a mechanism for resolving that set out,
That's and now you're going right back into, funding of all of these triggering events. So let's talk about funding for a second. Who wants to jump on there and talk about, some of the ways that we fund, an agreement? Michael Robinson.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, Michael, the whole funding piece, it's so basic, but it is so often overlooked. But the reality is, if you're going to have a buy-sell agreement that creates obligations of some sort, how are you going to fund those obligations? And, I know in many instances, life insurance is utilized as a tool to create some liquidity. That works if the triggering event is the death of someone, but otherwise that's not terribly helpful. So if you're trying to address other issues, how do you fund that? Do you create a sinking fund, for that to be available? Is there an agreement that when a triggering event that requires a buyout occurs, is there some provision for that payout to happen over time? If so, is it a fixed payment? Is it based on profitability or revenues? Those are some of the things, but, or maybe there's just, it's a cash rich enterprise and they've just got money, that's going to be available. Financing, that's an option too in a lot of instances. So, how you do it is going to depend on again, the structure of the company, what kind of resources does it have, as well as on what is the nature of the triggering event. But boy, the funding aspect is just, is so important.
Who cares if you have an agreement? If you can't fund it, then it's all meaningless at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But what I've seen a lot of is vendor takebacks secured by share pledges or promissory notes. The vendor actually enters into this agreement, the exiting shareholder, and, they're paid over time. A lot is what needs to happen because, if you're not in a cash rich operation or the other shareholders don't have enough assets to, put up as collateral from the bank, you've got to go the VTB route, which, for the exiting shareholder, that's not necessarily the best because you're not getting that lump sum cash. But it may be the only way to work it is payment over time.
Right.
And,
there's always that's a great point, Michael. There's just practical considerations that come into play as part of this. But even going back to the life insurance, then, okay, who's going to pay the premium? How do you, what if they don't pay the premium? How do you monitor that? There's just always something.
Of course. And then, it's thinking about in a family business, and we've seen this because the current owners are planning and working until they're 70 or, they're going to keep going. So term insurance doesn't work.
Right.
In that circumstance, because you just can't hold it that long, where term insurance in a buy-sell agreement makes the most sense because it's inexpensive. More often than not, it's, a great way to do that. But then there's no cash value. So there's no asset where so there's all of these pieces where I think that's where the two of us, the three of us would really, get along well, is because from a planning perspective, we want to model these things. Okay, so you've got a buy-sell agreement. Let me show you what, a 10% down at 5% on $3 million looks like before tax and after tax to your business. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe we need to do this for 15 years. And now how does that 15-year agreement look like in your retirement when you get out there?
Sure. Yeah.
So it really does make, a boatload of difference. We utilize life insurance on a pretty regular basis for funding the death side of buy-sells. As you said, who's paying for it? Regardless of whether it's a cross purchase or a stock redemption, a lot of times we will have the company pay for it, but if it's personally owned, then it has to be Section 162 bonused out to everybody. But now at least the company's paying for it, so everybody knows what's going on. If it's permanent insurance, you might be able to get some double duty out of it, but I always caution people, life insurance, I'm a big fan of it should have one purpose as often as it possibly can. Anything outside of that is just gravy.
Yeah, no, I agree.
It's yeah, that funding piece, I think it's modeling what you're looking at and understanding. Here's what we agreed to on paper, but what does that look like realistically?
Right.
It's funny because you could have a buy-sell agreement that has a shotgun clause as part of it, but those clauses are often abused if they know that the other shareholder can't finance or fund the purchase. So then they can end up actually stealing the shares away from you because, hey, I know you can't pay for this anyway, so I'm going to exercise the shotgun clause.
So remind everybody what the shotgun clause is real quick.
Yeah, so essentially one shareholder makes an offer to the other and this says, if you don't buy the shares back from me, then, then I can buy them back from you, essentially.
Yep. It's funny. We call that the Russian roulette, the same. I hadn't heard it called the shotgun, scenario before. That's why I was asking.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I've seen it in sealed bid where it's like we both put the number of the business into the business and the highest number wins. And so those are some of the ways that they do that. But like you said, Michael Paiva, I didn't even think about that. If one shareholder has more money than the other one, that's pretty tricky. That's tricky. Anything else when it comes to funding that either of you want to add to what we've done here today?
Just, I think to your point, it is you got to address it up front and you got to run the numbers, and you can't just say, well, I'm going to, buy this insurance, or we're going to do an installment sale or whatever. You really have to look at what are the economic realities. Maybe you've got some cash flow where you can start a sinking fund, but you have some term insurance to cover, the initial period until you're comfortable that the fund is up to where you want it to be. But yeah, you got to look at whatever you're thinking about. Realistically, can you afford it?
Which goes back to what I think we talked about in the beginning at one point, was just that a buy-sell agreement is not a set it and forget it agreement.
Exactly.
It needs to be reviewed. You need to look at it. The value of the company, changes over time. The people change over the time. What your needs are changes over time. So this is this is a live document that should be reviewed.
Yeah, it's not something that goes on a shelf, and that's that.
Great.
Even though most of the time, let's be honest, that's what our clients do. Business owners, they don't like paying lawyers. Attorneys, accountants, they're just really boring people. They're always overcomplicating things. But please, to our listeners, you've got to take a look at the agreement every few years. And you may save a lot in legals by avoiding a dispute if you just pay that little bit of money for the planning and for the updated agreement.
Yeah, you can think of the meeting with your attorney or your planner and advisory team and, as insurance. So you can pay a little bit to have this all covered, or you can pay a lot later. And, that's a really great place. Family that I've, worked with, they didn't have the valuation pegged down properly. And one of the family members wanted to leave. And, I said to them, your buy-sell agreement isn't up to snuff. We were getting ready to fix it, and he decided to leave right then. It was a great time for him to, or her to step aside. And when, you look at those things, had it been reviewed by one of the two of you, 3 years earlier, they wouldn't have been in the situation at that point. And it cost them more because the attorney's fees, they were fighting and they were going back and forth. And those attorney's fees, I was shocked at how fast, when you start talking litigation, they start to add up really quick, don't they, Michael Paiva?
Goodness gracious. Yeah. You want to avoid paying litigators at all costs. Seriously, to the listeners, avoid litigation fees at all costs. I'm not joking, because they get astronomical really quick. Not only that, you're paying your own forensic accountant to be the hired gun in terms of seeking your valuation of the shares. Right. So, it's great. It's great if it works. If it works until it doesn't. I've got a client, they've done hundreds of $1 million and they've got a group of company worth hundreds of millions. And so I'm kind of advising on the up and comers in the family, like, how are we going to facilitate this transition? And they have not one shareholder agreement. And that's amazing. And if it can work, that's great, but it works until it doesn't work. It's the question is when it ceases to work, how are we going to deal with this?
Got it. So we're coming up on the top of the hour. Let's do this. Any last words or thoughts that you want to share about buy-sell agreements? But more importantly, when you wrap up, make sure people know how they can get a hold of you. Where can they find you? I think either one of you should be spending some time with these people that are listening right now and helping them to review their buy-sell agreement.
Yeah, Michael Robinson here. The most important thing is to have one. And then of course you want to make sure it's appropriate for your situation, but it's an investment. It's an investment in your business. And if this is something that's important to you and you want to see it continue, whether it's within the family or not, you need to address these issues. If they're difficult conversations, they're difficult. There are people who can help you facilitate them if necessary. But the conversations need to be had. It needs to be memorialized in writing, and it needs to be reviewed on a regular basis.
Great. And how do people get a hold of you?
Sure. You can access me through our website, which is www.mrobinsonlaw.com. You can shoot an email to info@mrobinsonlaw.com. And if you want to give us a phone call, 585-374-5210.
Beautiful. Michael, appreciate it. Michael Paiva.
Yeah, absolutely. You need an agreement and you need it to be as clear and as practical as possible. Think about the practical implications of how you're going to facilitate that agreement. Think about how you're going to resolve disputes. That's the most important thing from my perspective, is how are we going to resolve any dispute? If you want to get in touch, you can email me at m.paiva@rplawyers.ca or by phone 416-800-1733.
Beautiful. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time and sharing your information and knowledge with our listeners. And I bid you adieu and really appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm Michael Palumbos with Family Wealth and Legacy in Rochester, New York, and you've been listening to the Family Biz Show. Make sure to chime in for our next episode, and should find us on your favorite podcast. If if this is your first time listening, subscribe so that you don't miss another episode. Have a great day, everybody.